one question perhaps to ask is this the Suez moment? This is in 1956, of course, when Britain, France, and Israel conspired together to attack Egypt, and United States pulled them back effectively. And Britain was confirmed as a waning power. United States was confirmed as a rising power. I don't think it's a very good analogy because, first of all, by 1956, it was clear that Britain is a waning power with so many real indicators. Already, Harold Macmillan, would come to say to America, we will be Greece, you be Rome, right? And of course, there was the United States to replace. Whereas, what is the idea? The idea is not that China would replace the United States. But I think in a more limited way, it's clear that the age of preponderant unilateral American power is over. And Trump learns that he can't, in fact, just dictate everything he wants. And Iran will be a reminder of that.
It's not a Suez moment because, unlike with Britain and France in 56, there is no higher power to rein in the United States, right? There were adults in the room. The Soviets and the Americans were saying, no, we can't really allow this to happen. Now there is no adult in the room, right? The so-called adult has gone rogue. As you say, the preponderance of American military and economic power is such that no other power can balance or deter it. There is just great disorder, right? A dying empire lashing out as it dies, and the rest of us have to suffer the consequences.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Bunga Cast, the global politics podcast. At the start of history. Well, okay, no, we're not going to do that. That might be premature. At the end of history, we'll have to have a meeting internally to decide whether it's the start of history already or merely still the end of history. So that's what we'll go with for now. I'm Alex O'Healy in São Paulo, Brazil. I'm joined today by contributing editor Lee Jones, who's a professor of international politics at Queen Mary University, who's written a lot about U.S. foreign policy, particularly recently, including a detailed analysis of the national security strategy, which we discussed on this podcast. And welcoming back onto the podcast I've lost count really, Arash Azizi, who's a historian whose latest book is What Iranians Want: Women, Life, Freedom, and he's a writer for The Atlantic. You'll have heard him on Bungaycast on similar matters, on, for example, episode 150, Shadow Commander, which, to remind you, just because this is relevant to the discussion we're having today, in 2020, the US assassinated Iran's Shadow Commander, Qasem Soleimani, and everyone thought World War III was about to break out. And then he was on in episode 444, Opportunism and Revenge in the Middle East, also with Karl Sharro, where we discussed Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 2024. So in a way, what we're going to be discussing today is very much a continuation of conversations we've had with Arash on this podcast over a number of years. Listeners will have guessed that we're talking about the Iran war, of course. We're recording this on Friday, the 10th of April. So that means that today talks have begun in Islamabad, Pakistan, between the US and Iran, which means that for now, a third world war has been averted, or as it probably would be called, the first global special military operation, as it seems that a lot of great powers are interested in euphemisms for war. So to set this up, Operation Epic Fury was launched on the 28th of February. So we're talking several weeks on from the start of the war. The initial justification was that it was a preemptive strike against the Iranian threat. Then it was about regime change, ostensibly to liberate Iranians, to most recently bombing Iran back to the Stone Age and wiping a civilization off the face of the earth. If you think taboos serve an important social purpose, then the breaking of that taboo, even if just rhetorical, is rather chilling. U.S. military goals have also shifted from merely targeting nuclear or missile infrastructure to wanting to achieve a complete victory, to then simply wanting to open the Strait of Hormuz. A lot of this is, of course, discourse and rhetoric, and we want to try to get behind that. But I think it's notable that wanting to open the Strait of Hormuz as a war aim is the ultimate perma-war justification, war to undo the consequences of the war that you just started. And some, of course, maintain that the operation is called Epic Fury, so that when you Google Trump Ep, you'd be presented with the war rather than with Trump Epstein. So there's lots of possible explanations for what has happened. And we're also back to a theme that we've discussed over a number of podcasts this year as Trump's second administration accelerates the undoing of the post-Cold War order. So is Trump inconsistent, short-termist, possibly insane, or is everything that Trump does part of some Trumpian master plan, where even the threat of genocide is a clever four-dimensional chess move to achieve immediate practical aims? I think we've come down on the fact that it's somewhere in the middle over a number of episodes, but there's a lot to say beyond just, well, the truth is somewhere in the middle. There's a lot to unpick. And even if this is the end of the Iran war for now, we want to explore not just what the motives were for the war, but the extent to which this was an Israeli war, perhaps in the first place, what the regional consequences will be, maybe what this means for warfare in general, as Iran managed to expose US vulnerabilities, how this war will change Iran, both its state and society, and the international political economic consequences, especially relating to the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. And if we have time after all of that, we might try to touch on how this impacts Europe and its relations to the US, whether China is the real winner here, whether Trump has lost MAGA, et cetera, et cetera. So it's obviously a big episode. There's a lot to get through. So I'm going to try to say less and bring in our guest, Arash. Now, Arash, you have an article that came out in The Atlantic yesterday talking about the upcoming negotiations, which have started today. So one of the things that you highlight in the article is what each side is bringing to the negotiation table as a starting position. And there is a lot there, none of which, or very little of which, I think will be agreed upon because of the very diverging starting points. But maybe you could talk us through this, Arash. How likely do you believe some sort of agreement is?
Yeah, first of all, I should say that my first ever appearance on your podcast was in January 2018. So even before ceremony was
right.
killed. And that was about the Iranian protest. And that matters to me because, in fact, that was my first ever podcast on not just your podcast, ever. First time I ever did a podcast, I believe that was then. So this is why this podcast has a special place in my heart, although I remain generally anti-podcast, but we can talk about that later.
That's a reasonable position. That's fine.
That's not scarred for life then.
That's the difference. I'm pro going on podcasts. All right.
Principles and practices are different things. Anyway, go on.
So, first of all, we are now, I don't know when you're releasing this, but we're talking about noon New York time on Friday. Iran hasn't actually confirmed that they are in Islamabad. There's a podium. There's a nice picture of all the flags of Iran, America, and Pakistan there. J.D. Vance is there. But Iran is actually saying that they're not going. And just before we spoke, maybe half an hour before, Ghalibaf was the man calling the shots and the one supposedly heading the Iranian delegation declared two new preconditions. He said Iran would only take part, one new and one older precondition, that Iran would take part only if Israel stops attacking Lebanon, and also if Iran's blocked finances are released. The second one is huge, of course, because which block finances? U.S. has blocked and frozen billions of dollars of Iranian assets over the years. And then there are others, like on a smaller measures, South Korea has done it, others have done it. So he seems to be throwing a wrench into those negotiations. But look, so let me just give you the broader picture and to get to the question of, is a deal possible or not? Of course, a deal is possible. And it's not about the details of what they disagree about. What are the disagreements? The U.S. has traditionally wanted a couple of things from Iran, broadly speaking. First, so that change its nuclear program so that it doesn't threaten. Basically, change its nuclear program so that doesn't threaten building a nuclear weapon, basically. So it can assure that it remains a peaceful nuclear program. That's the number one thing U.S. has wanted. The number two thing is limit its missile program, ballistic missiles and non-ballistic missiles, so that it's less threatening. Number three thing is the so-called proxies, i.e. Iran has stopped military support for these militias in the Arab world, like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Palestine, which are the most important ones, and the Iraqi Shia militias. These are the three things U.S. has wanted. And now the added thing is opening the Hormuz Strait, which is kind of interesting because, as you said, before the war, it was never an issue. Iran's threat to close off the Hormuz Strait, I don't know what's the equivalent. It's like, I don't know, everyone's father has like this one wild card that they always play, like that, I'll do that, but it's one thing he would never do. So Iran for
Mm.
years threatened to close the Hormuz Strait. It really sounded like some impossible thing that it would never do. Now it's done it. It's rather works for it. So we have a whole new mm, problem here. And Iran on the other side. So these are the three things US has wanted, plus the fourth one on the Hormuz. And what does Iran want? Is Iran wants the sanctions on it lifted, and for promises for it to not to be attacked, some sort of a non-belligerence. And of course, it's possible to find formula so that some sort of an agreement is reached there. But in my opinion, the devil here is not actually in the details. It's sort of, it's in what diplomats love to call it political will or capitals, which is just sort of also a euphemism for, do you actually want it? Do you want a deal or not? If you want a deal, you're not gonna break it over little things. So that's really the question. Now, I believe US obviously wants a deal, and the in Iran has a new leadership effectively, and we can talk about that. But Ghalibaf, this guy that we can spend some time talking about if you want as well. He's nominally a speaker of the parliament, but he's the most powerful figure in Iran's National Security Council. This guy has been wanting the top job all his life, and all of it, finally, thanks to US killing most of his rivals, frankly, he now happens to be the strongest man in Iran. And ultimately, yes, I think he is also someone who would want to deal with the US. So I see that as a total possibility, but it's a rocky path to get there, because Ghalibaf has to. And let me end this answer by saying this: the most important difficulty for both sides is their constituencies, so to speak. Not quite constitution, not as in popular constituency, but Ghalibaf would need to bring the regime behind him. That means the Revolutionary Guards, different factions of the regime. We need to bring them all behind him to make what would be a really taboo-breaking historic deal. Let's not forget, this would be, if Iran makes a deal with the United States, this would be a huge matter. Iran has only really made a couple of deals with the United States on this scale ever. The Islamic Republic has, and this one might be the biggest ever, especially if it leads to economic openings and all that. So he would need to do that, and Trump would need to placate Israel, its ally, and other elements in his camp to move enough to like lift the sanctions and do all that is necessary to make a deal happen. But so yeah, I think it's entirely possible, but it's a tough path to get there because of all these differences that I said. So yeah, the differences between the two sides on the issues are huge, but there's if you really want it, I hope it's clear what I mean here, right? If you really want it, everyone knows they're not gonna get 0 or 10, right? And there are ways to find paths in between, and I can talk about each issue to explain to you why. But yeah, it's really about political will. It's about them deciding they want to get this done.
Mm. Well, that makes a lot of sense, and particularly with regard to the fact that Iran won this war, or to the extent that we can at least close the chapter on this part of the war. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but Iran won this war, and so maybe it would be less likely to accept the Americans' terms or whatever the negotiated agreement would be, whereas the U.S. as the loser of the war might be in a situation where it needs an agreement. I mean, this seems to be what you're suggesting, Arash, that the Americans would be more in need of some sort of agreement, something that they can show for it. I don't know. Is that right?
No, I mean, look, the thing is, both sides have real reasons to want a deal. If you talk about that, both sides have real reasons to want a deal. Yes, the US have very real reasons to want a deal because, the war has not gone well for them. The global economy is in trouble. Trump sort of has egg on his face. But Iran also really needs a deal, even more in some ways, because look, it needs economic reconstruction. It needs the attacks to stop. I mean, Iran is not doing well. Economically, it has to rule over a ruin effectively. It will have a lot of dissatisfaction at home. And also, yes, it's taken 40 days of attacks. It's remained in place and all that. But I mean, every day of these attacks are really tough. To just give you one example, for example, most of Iran's airports are out of commission. And much of its civilian aircraft is out of commission. Something as basic as, and Iran is a big country, not as big as Brazil, but it's pretty big. So something as basic as like taking a flight from one part of Iran to the other, it's it's in question whether that can regularly happen anymore. I mean, just imagine what of a big sort of obstacle that is, right? So both sides have real reasons to come to sort of a deal. They also have reasons to come to a deal for short, in a short term, and also in the more long term reasons. I apologize for the line noises
Yeah,
here.
these aren't sound effects that I've added just for listeners.
This is Brooklyn. This is Brooklyn,
Yeah.
and that's how it is. Yes.
I mean, yeah, I think it comes down to a question of pain tolerance and different sensitivities. And obviously, Iran is in a more difficult situation, but at the same time, a lot of American vulnerabilities have been exposed, particularly with its Gulf allies. But I think that's a question which will come on to as we move forward, especially towards the end, as we kind of look at some of the longer term consequences geopolitically of this war. But maybe we should roll back to the start, which is, why did Trump go to war in the first place? I don't know if we need to rehearse all of the reasons why it might be a surprise that Trump went to war, but of course he did campaign on the promise in part on no new wars. There's the understanding of Trump as someone who prefers achieving a deal over war, even if he's very willing to practice brinkmanship in pursuit of such a deal. But on the other hand, he's obviously a guy who likes quick wins. And there's the backdrop of the 12-day war of June 2025. And of course, the recent kind of clinical coup in Venezuela, which may have whetted Trump's appetite for these sorts of quick wins. And maybe he thought that Iran would be that. So what's your read, Arash, and indeed Lee as well, having as someone who's kind of studied Trump's foreign policy in quite a lot of depth, what the motivation is for Trump going to war here? Why did he do this? And I think maybe it's worth being explicit in saying that, to a certain extent, it came as a surprise, right? Was anyone not? Maybe that's
Not
the
a
right
surprise
question
to
to ask.
me.
Is anyone not surprised by the
I'm
fact
not
that?
surprised. I wasn't surprised.
Okay,
I
go
mean,
on.
you don't need to take my word for it. I've written about before as well. I thought it was likely. I mean, I thought it was likely at some point. But I also thought, all cards on the table. When Trump first got reelected, I thought he would have a deal with Iran within months, right? So, I mean, that was my prognosis. But after the 12-day war last year, I thought he could go to war again. Okay, so am I responding now, or Lee is?
No, well, go ahead, continue. Yeah.
I just have started. No, look. So why did Trump do it? Look, Trump is the biggest mistake was people thought Trump was an isolationist. He was never isolationist. He was a unilateralist, right? And a hemispherist. After Marco Rubio was appointed, it was clear that he would be hemispherist. Bad news for you guys who are, as they
Well, I
say.
mean, I yeah. Although he is bombing Iran right now, or
Yes,
has been,
yeah.
so
But the hemispherist part is important, as they said.
are we
Too far
talking
from
northern
God.
hemisphere? Because then maybe yes, he's a hemispherist.
Yes, no. So, anyways, the hemispherist part is very important, but unilateralist part was also important. Hemispherist part matters because he did Venezuela, and Venezuela worked great for him. I have this joke that only good leftists will appreciate, which is basically he is making the same mistake after Venezuela that a lot of leftist revolutionaries made after the Cuban Revolution of 1959, which was that, this is pretty easy. You walk in, you overthrow the government, you build a socialist government. So let's just try this everywhere. And of course, it didn't work anywhere ever again. It had worked in Cuba by a bit of a fluke. It doesn't really work like that anywhere again. And Trump, we have to pause here to just appreciate what a spectacular success Venezuela has been for Trump from his own point of view. He walked in the country. He just, took in a commando operation, took the president and his wife out, and the entire regime started working with him under, other figures which they had probably negotiated with before, right? But the United States embassy has reopened in Caracas, and they're working with each other and all that. Of course, it's not if you wanted democracy or whatever in Venezuela, that's not a success. But if you wanted a government that plays ball with you, and you have relations with, it worked. So it's tempting. If you can have something like that, why not do it in other places? And frankly, it's not. And this was the discussion in Iran has been from the beginning, before the war, during the war, and after the war. Is there an Iranian Delcy Rodriguez? Can you do something similar in Iran? And it's not actually. And it's like a lot of things with Iran, people get into these camps of saying one thing or the other, but it's not actually entirely crazy to think something similar could happen. It still could happen in Iran effectively, which is that if you get rid of these leaders, you change, you make some change in leaders, you can deal, with the new leadership and get some of the things that you want. And we can talk about, what I mean there. There's a lot of caveats and a lot of, intricate points. But why? What did Trump want? In short, he wanted a short, a spectacular success. He said he will go in, he will kill Khamenei, he'll either get a capitulation or some sort of a deal, and he will also be the guy who solved Iran, right? A problem that has bedeviled every president since Carter. He will solve it. And of course, I think this was kind of rather foolish. It was clear that it won't get solved as quickly as he thinks it is. And the Iranian protest had provided an opening because there was a lot of protests going on in January. Regime massacred thousands of people on the street. So there was this idea that he will go in, and I think some idea was that the regime would collapse. Some idea was that it would capitulate. Some idea was that, there would be a Delsit scenario. And these are very different things, right? But yeah, so I think that's why he intervened. Yeah, and he quickly found out that it's just not going to be very easy. Yeah.
Lee, what was your read on this? I mean, I suspect you were a bit surprised.
I was certainly more surprised than Arash claims to be, but I think some of what Arash says is right, and some of it I disagree with. So it is easily the most insane war of my lifetime, and I think almost everybody I have spoken to has been quite taken aback by just how erratic and mad it seems to have been. And so I think there is an explanation for it, but I think it's a long explanation, so bear with me. So just to take a step back, as you said at the top, Alex, the line that I have been trying to develop through Bungercast and articles in American Affairs is that we can't, Trump is part of a wider cadre of people that have come to power. He's part of a movement that is now in power in Washington. So we can't just have a focus on him alone. So I've been trying to understand, what is this movement? What is this cadre of people around him? And as Arash says, there is a commitment to unilateralism. There's a commitment to US primacy. And there are ideas associated with paleoconservatism. But it is a highly personalist and a populist regime. So you have to leave space in your analysis for individual caprice and delusions, shared delusions, shaping policy, not national interests. So I've been clear that I don't think that US policy is realist. I don't think it's hemispheric, right? That is a very bizarre outcome for a hemispheric foreign policy. It proves that it's not a hemispheric foreign policy. What it is the pursuit of US primacy with continued interventionism, including intervention in the Middle East. So the way that I see the Iran war is it's a war of caprice driven by a personalist, populist regime that is incapable of rationally channeling constituents' interests into a national interest-driven foreign policy. So, how is this? How do we kind of understand the decision-making process? There's a very good piece in the New York Times, which we'll put in the show notes, that reconstructs, there's a lot of insider information has been passed to these journalists about the run-up to the war and the decision-making process, the discussions inside the Situation Room. And I'm going on that because that's the best source that we have so far. So firstly, Netanyahu visited Washington to incite the Americans to attack Iran. And he presented it in two ways. Firstly, there's a threat from Iran, claims about the nuclear program, the longest running 6 months away. We've had this for 20 years, that the Iranians are building up their missile and drone capabilities. Secondly, there's an opportunity. So Mossad chief was at the meeting and said, firstly, the Ayatollah and senior leaders will be meeting above ground. So that was an opportunity for a decapitation strike. Secondly, the Iranians' missile capabilities could be degraded completely within a few weeks. Thirdly, Mossad could foment popular uprising and a Kurdish invasion. And fourthly, there was minimal threat of Iranian retaliation against American assets in the region. So, the Israelis have been pushing the Americans to do this for 20 years, and they finally found someone to go along with it. The question is, why did they go along with it this time? And I will say there's four things. Firstly, this is not out of nowhere. This is one of the things I agree strongly with Arash about, right? hostility to Iran is baked into the American establishment and the counter elite. And Trump has form on this, right? Trump apparently has been talking about seizing Karg Island from the Iranians since the late 1980s. In his first term, he was extremely hawkish on Iran, scrapping Obama's nuclear deal, maximum pressure sanctions, assassinating the IRGC commander, as we talked about with Arash back at the time.
And it seems, I don't know if this is your read on this, but some people have argued that the Trump regime in some ways is very personalistic, and the way that one accounts for his hawkishness on Iran is really just an anti-Obama thing, that he wants to do the not Obama thing and not do a deal. I don't know.
I think this is where I think Arash is right, though. It is about Obama. I think he's obsessed with Obama, and there's a kind of racialized dimension to this, I believe. And I think he, became fixated with the idea that he could solve this problem better than Obama. But I think also Arash is quite right that there is this egotistical fantasy that he can be the person that finally removes the thorn from the American side, that all these loser presidents beforehand, they couldn't do it, but I will, and my face will be engraved on Mount Rushmore. So I think there's a whole history there with Iran, and it's not limited to Trump, but Trump has the history. This is where he's not president of peace. He's very hawkish on Iran himself. Second reason I think why Netanyahu's pitch was appealing is I think Trump needed a diversionary war, given his rising domestic unpopularity. This is to do with the very negative domestic reaction to the ICE crackdowns in urban centres, cost of living issues, the Epstein files. I think one important way to understand the way Trump rules is he's a TV guy. Every week has got to be a new episode. He's got to be the main character. Here's the new surprise. He's keeping everybody on his toes. There's a cliffhanger. He's got to exude main character energy every single week to keep people engaged and interested. And I think he wanted a diversionary war. Thirdly, again, this is where I agree with Arash. Definitely he was emboldened by Venezuela. I think it's quite likely that this war with Iran would not have happened without the Venezuela intervention, despite, as has been clearly revealed, the wildly different context, which means that you can't cut and paste the same policies and have the same effect. And then the fourth thing, which comes out really clearly in the New York Times report, is that Trump has surrounded himself with a cadre of people, which makes understanding what they think and how they see the world important. But crucially, this cadre of people are completely sycophantic. So what the report shows is that the intelligence agencies in the United States did push back against this hard sell from the Israelis, but none of the people in the room were willing to say to Trump, don't do this, this is nuts. The way that they broke down Netanyahu's pitch into four pieces, four different objectives, and said, can we do it and can't we do it? Firstly, killing the Ayatollah. They said, yeah, we could probably do that with American firepower. Can we destroy the Iranian military? Yes, we can probably do that. Now, it turns out that's a significant failure of American intelligence, but they thought it was plausible. Thirdly and fourthly, popular uprising in Iran. And fourthly, regime change to a secular regime. Like the CIA director said this was farcical. Rubio said it was bullshit. Vance was skeptical. Kane, who was then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he was also skeptical. But on balance, Trump still felt it was worth it. Why? Because I think this is a significant difference between the paleoconservative mindset animating the current regime rather than past regimes, is that regime change is of relatively little interest. They don't really care about regime change. So the regime change bit is not going to work. That doesn't matter. If we can decapitate the Iranian leadership and then get them to do what we want, that's a win for us. So I think that...
Yeah, I mean, regime change here, by that you mean quite specifically the kind of liberal democracy promotion.
I mean what Netanyahu was selling to Trump, which is we can foment a popular uprising and we can facilitate a Kurdish invasion and so on and so forth. And it appears that weapons may even have been passed to the Kurds, right? Trump said it at some point in time. So it seems like they pulled all the levers. So they're kind of hoping for it. But we know, because Trump's remarkably transparent in many ways. And he said, well, we were going to negotiate with these three guys, but unfortunately we've killed them all, right? We've been so successful. We're winning so bigly. We've killed all these people. So I think
It
they're
was never clear
disinterested.
what he exactly meant by that, but I think he meant Ali Shamkhani. I mean, that's my,
Right.
anyway,
But I think where, Arash, I agree with him again. I think he thought that given American military primacy, you could effect a very quick victory. So he dismissed warnings he was given about the weaponization of the Strait of Hormuz and the attacks on American regional assets. But the crucial thing is he went round and asked everybody, what do you think? Hegseth was saying, yeah, let's do it. Hardly surprising. Kane seemed to have argued both sides, which is very different to the first term, where his generals saw their role as trying to restrain him from doing stupid shit. Rubio apparently favoured continuing maximum pressure, didn't really favour war, but didn't try to talk Trump out of it. His domestic advisors didn't flag the impact that he was going to have domestically, but just meekly said, well, it's your decision, Mr. President, and we'll just try to handle it, whatever you decide. So ultimately, if you take the sort of MAGA mindset, which is a commitment to US primacy, including where necessary the use of force to batter your enemies, a disinterest in promoting, liberal regime change, plus the caprice that comes with a personalist regime, then I think that produces the Iran war decision. That would be my take on given the information that we've currently got available.
Arash, I don't know, do you want to comment on that? Because I think we also should bring in the Israeli question. Specifically, whether this is Netanyahu's war. I think there's an attempt, even amongst some of MAGA, including Tucker Carlson and others, to kind of blame this exclusively on Israel, to still place faith in Trump, the notion of Trump as, if not anti-war or dovish, at least a certain kind of, I guess, a more realist Trump, or at least who would a Trump in which they can believe that his promises of no new wars is a genuine one, and then it allows you to blame the Jews, basically. In at least in the case of the American far right, that there should be these Jewish interlopers, not just in terms of Netanyahu and the Israeli establishment, but also even the neocons themselves and neocon intellectuals, many of whom are Jewish. And in that worldview, Trump's the good guy, and it's a little bit of the good Tsar, bad boyar's explanation for why Trump went to war. Now, that's nonsense, and for all the reasons I think that Lee has said. But on the other hand, there is an element of if not the tail wagging the dog, because that would probably be an incorrect way to put it, but it's certainly Netanyahu's plan, it seems, that if this New York Times reporting that Lee referred to is true, that it would seem to be very much Netanyahu's plan, which was then bought by the Americans. How do you read that?
First of all, in general, it's interesting. I write books about like recent events as well. I'm a historian by trade, so I like to. I'm just before, right now, I'm writing a chapter on 1956, and we have, in the Suez invasion, and we have all the documents in the world and all the declassified, and then you start to get in a picture. So I'm always a little skeptical of these newspaper reports where they speak to a couple of sources, they have a full image of what happened. And I mean, skeptical. I'm not saying they're lying, but I'm just saying, they're quickly produced. I'm in awe of how they can do it. I can never do it for my books even. I mean, if you look at my book on Soleimani and others, I do these things, but I'm very cautious and conservative with it. I let it sometime pass. Only when everybody says something, I'll write it. And so, whether exactly if things are exactly as you read in these reports or not, I have, I have reason to sort of take it with a grain of salt. I'm just saying, we shouldn't take it as this is not a minute of what actually happened in these meetings, right? It's based on what a couple of people said, and history shows that people change their words, or other people will say, well, that's not how it went down exactly, and of course we will have reasons when they do these leaks, right? Okay.
To be clear, so I was trained as a historian too, and did a lot of archival work early in my career, so I totally agree with you.
Yeah,
right. I'm just saying this. Journalism is only ever a first cut of history.
100%.
But it's the best
100%.
insight. It's the best insight that we've got, and I think a lot of it rings true given what we know about the way the regime works. I think it's in line with the kind of structural analysis of the regime that I've set out elsewhere.
For sure. Yeah, no, I just said that generally, right? Not just in response to this, but
No,
just
it's a very fair point.
yeah, as a general point, I'm just saying. Okay, so but let's talk about, and then so if you do agree that it fits with the structural analysis, we can just stick to talking about that as much. I'm not like we can also talk about the reports, but I mean, okay. So I think in terms of the whole realist no war stuff, I mean, people say all these things, right? I think actually, and let me say a couple of things about the Trump being hawkish. I think Trump, he's remarkably, at least quoting quotations, honest. Obviously, no one is honest in campaigning. So when they say, no war, I mean, if you're foolish enough to fall for that, as some people did, good for them, right? But it was always clear that, he has certain foreign policy goals. And there's something fundamentally true there, that his foreign policy goals are more transactional. I don't know if that makes them realist. More transactional, more simple in a way. Like he genuinely doesn't care about bad guys being in power in any ways. He genuinely obviously doesn't care about liberal democracy. Although, may I just open a parenthesis here, also say, the left in general doesn't seem to decide what the heck does it want its foreign policy to be. For example, does it think dealing with dictators is good or bad? Because when Biden, goes to meet with the Saudis, the people on the left are, look, they don't care about human rights, whatever. But if Biden or a Democrat says anything to, criticize the human rights regime of other places, it's not our place to do it. So, just like if hating the daddy is your only mode and you just want to hate the Democrat, you can do it. But
well,
it doesn't
a point that's been made on this podcast a number of times that
There
is
we go.
indeed what the
Yes,
left is about. But anyway, go on.
Exactly. Okay. So, but let me just like focus on Trump. So I want to say in the first term, Trump, yes, he left the Obama deal, and yes, it was all about Obama. I agree with you there. But with the important caveat, he left the deal not in favor of a hawkish line in Iran, in a very real way. He left the deal, and it was very clear that all he wanted was the exact same deal that we just called the Trump deal. And he really did go out of his way to try to appeal to Iran. Like he mediated with Macron and with Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister of Japan at the time. And yes, so he killed Soleimani, it's true, as part of his brinksmanship, but he wanted a deal with Iran in a very real way before and after. And in this second round as well, he has started, with those talks. And there is this question, why did the talks collapse and the US attack Iran in the middle of talks twice? The first talks collapsing, I think a very good, a very likely reason for that was that Iranians were too slow for his taste, basically. And he was like, you know what, we'll try to military way. Anyway, so we can take a conversation in different ways, but I just want to say that I think he wanted a deal. I think he wants a deal with Iran. I think he genuinely doesn't care that these are like bad guys or they're Islamist or whatever. He just wants a deal, and he wants to be the one who did it. He's very flexible in some ways, but he also doesn't understand all the little details, and what are they not immediately making deal with him, and he doesn't understand. And now he's kind of burnt his fingers because he thought there would be a military pushover, and of course there were not a military pushover. Now, whether Netanyahu really believed, Netanyahu was, let me just put it this way, he was dumb enough to believe that this war would lead to a popular uprising and the regime will come down. My assumption is that people in power are usually not that stupid, actually. I know it can be a controversial assumption, but...
No, it was a hard sell to get the Americans on board, yeah?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So this was like a ruse to get the Americans on board. But even if Trump even...
not stupid.
Yeah. So, but I mean, was Trump stupid enough to believe that? I mean, maybe.
No. No, the Americans said they didn't believe that, but they thought they could do the first two bits: decapitation, destroying Iran's military assets. They believed they could do that. The other stuff they thought was just bullshit. Okay, great. All right. So order is in the universe, yes, and it was clear that they could have done these things. Yeah. Yeah. So now we can talk about different things, but the whole realist whatever thing, the realist being peaceful, whatever. It's not clear to me why realist means you don't attack. I mean, let me just come back on the realist point very briefly, because being a realist means, yes, okay, you don't particularly mind bad guys being in power if that's in your interest, and you could take a transactional approach. But realism also means having a clear sense of your own interests and a rational pursuit of those interests. And I think
and your opponent's interests as well, because I think there's a kind of a sense that the Iranians don't have, or are, because of American supremacy, everyone else is weak, and that therefore they must bow before the Americans. I mean, at least the public pronouncements of Trump seems to be premised on that notion, rather than Iran maybe having their own interests.
I think he really thought that. I think he really thinks the US, we have big fucking guns, so how dare would they not, And it's not actually that crazy of a thing to say, right? When you think about it a little, it could work in certain scenarios, but it was clear that it was not going to work in this scenario.
Yeah, and so that's the sense in which calling the Trump administration, a realist foreign policy, I think that's just for the birds. Anybody who thinks that, I've got a bridge to tell you, right? This is not the rational pursuit of national self-interest. If you look at the realists in American international relations, yet again, they're lining up to criticize an American war, but they can only lament what's going on, right? This shouldn't be happening according to their theory. What states should be doing is rationally pursuing their self-interest. That is not what the United States has done over the past 40-odd days. Far from it. It's a massive strategic catastrophe for the United States.
And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. I just want to use a very lame metaphor, but, kind of rotate the map. We've been looking at this from the perspective of Washington, and perhaps now we need to look at it from the Israeli perspective as well. To a certain extent, one could write the entire history, certainly of the Middle East, of the past 3 years from the Israeli perspective, and one could learn quite a lot just from that. Israel, on the one hand, has scored a series of big victories since the 7th of October 2023. Assad Syria has fallen. It's killed Nasrallah in Lebanon. Hamas took a beating, etc. On the other hand, one can flip that around and go, yes, Assad Syria has fallen, but Hezbollah still persists in Lebanon. Hamas is still standing. Iran likewise. So one can tell that story in different ways, and particularly as regards Netanyahu's attempt at effectively pursuing permanent war in pursuit, ostensibly the aim being key sort of buffer zones throughout the Middle East, but ultimately premised on achieving complete supremacy in the region, and above all, preventing Iran from becoming nuclear armed. So it seems like my reading of it is that the attack on Iran now, and what Netanyahu sold Trump, was that, well, now is the time to do it. We've taken out, or at least severely weakened, Iran's proxies in the region, and therefore now is a good time to attack. So does this blow up in Israel's face as well? This has obviously been a strategic disaster for the US. Is it the same for Israel, or is Israel somewhat more insulated from that? And then the follow-on question from that would be, does Israel, and I mean, this, I don't want to do too much prospective stuff because it ends up being quite speculative, but the one question I will allow myself, because it has immediate relevance, is, does Israel need to keep the war going to keep the US involved?
Am I going first? Okay, so...
Well, I didn't actually... but Arash, you're our guest. You should go first, of course.
No, whatever. You guys decide. I'm a very obedient guest.
Okay, you go first.
Yes, exactly.
Israel clearly for some time has wanted the Islamic Republic to fall. There's a regime change desk in the Mossad, we know, for the past year or so. And that's very unlike Israel. It's good to actually remember, right? Israel doesn't usually care about the political nature of its opponents. It's very amoral, if you will. I don't know whether that's the right term, but it doesn't usually care about, right? It basically cares about, by the way, this is why the whole Mearsheimers and realist and stuff don't work. Israel in some ways is a very realist power in this way, that all it cares about its own very rather narrow interest, which is to, continue to exist and control its borders. And, it can't decide where the borders are always, but, so anyways, so it's very unlike Israel to want to change the political nature of, but it appears that at least very seriously it considers something like that for Iran. And in that case, yes, it has blown in its face. It does face an Iran that is a militarily weaker, Also, this taboo of military action against Iran has been broken now, so that's good news for it. So, okay, US attacked Iran twice; it could attack it again. Whereas, for the very big time, for a very long time, this was a very big taboo. But I consider Israeli policy in general, as usual, on the Iranian case and on the other cases, very short-sighted. I call it arsonist sometimes. It's basically like burn it all down, and it will. We won't have a problem immediately, right? If you burn it all down, but then what about? Like, it's not very long-sighted. Like, what's going to happen later. Now, some more foresighted people in the Israeli establishment apparently think that, after the war is over, then they can destabilize Iran, and they have a longer regime change plan, basically, which seems also very shaky to me. I'm not sure they can get it. But in terms of it so far, yeah, I think they're very worried about an Iranian-American deal. And by the way, the terms of debate in Iran inside the Iran establishment are always drawn like this. And especially now, the idea is a deal is bad for Israel. That's why the Iranian hardliners who oppose negotiations are always attacked. Oh, you're doing Mossad's work, right? You're agent provocateurs for Mossad. That's like traditionally the terms of debate inside the Iranian establishment. But yeah, so if this ends with the Iranian-American deal that normalizes the Islamic Republic in power somehow and opens up and makes Iran a stronger economy, maybe many in Israel might consider that a very bad thing for them. Although I am of the view that this is the least bad outcome for Israel, because an Iran that is dedicated, that is committed to some sort of a non-belligerence against US and its allies, and that is normalized and is integrated to the region, down the lane would have to give up on its sort of quest to destroy Israel and all that. And I think that is actually the least bad outcome. But two different view of looking at the world almost. Israelis think. And the last thing I'd say is, this whole mowing the lawn thing, which Israel has done with others, with Hamas and others. The theory is, yeah, we know we can't solve this. Mowing the lawn is the same thing. Managing, what do they call about the occupation? Sort of managing the occupation, managing the conflict was the same thing. The idea is, yeah, we can't have any lasting solution to any of these things. For as far as we know, forever we'll live under the sword. And every once in a while, we just go in, we kill a lot of people, we degrade these groups, and when we need to do it again, we'll just go in and do it again. And the caveat here is that, okay, that worked with Hamas and Hezbollah a little. It won't work so easily with a nation state of 90 million like Iran. That is going to have real consequences. If you want to do that to Iran all the time, you really are going to have unpredictable consequences coming out of that. Although they might think that they can degrade Iran, make it enough of a failed state mirrored in civil war that it just won't be a threat. Anyways, some answers to your question.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe we look at it from the perspective of Iran now. Arash, some people have spoken about the Islamic Republic now becoming more conservative as a consequence of this, making any sort of reform less likely. How do you read this? Do you think it will become a more repressive regime as a consequence of this? Is that the ultimate consequence of the kind of decapitation strategy?
I don't believe that at all. And it's funny because it's such a talking point here in the US, and the annoying part about it is that it's clear what it is an anti-Trump talking point. Now I'm as anti-Trump as anybody else, but it's unfortunate. This is really almost an American disease. Like, everything is about political football around Trump. So if Trump says something, you have to go out of your way to sound him wrong and stupid and ha 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 ha, you made the regime more hardliner. But I don't think that's true necessarily. And some people do it, some people do it with more or less sort of analysis. But first of all, I think we are in a period of interregnum. So we don't know what the new shape of the Iranian regime will be, nor do I. You don't know it either. Nobody else knows that either. You can't predict somehow, at most you can say that's the likely outcome. And then, so that's the number one problem with this theory of Iran becoming more hardened. There are two major theories with it. First of all is that this is the factional infighting is happening right now. It happened over Islamabad right now. Who's going to go to Islamabad? What are they going to agree upon, right? But we know that the National Security Council approved of the Islamabad talks happening. In the statement, very clear, they said they're happening. We'll extend them beyond 2 weeks if necessary. This already shows a willingness to negotiate, So we don't know what the result of this factional infighting will be. If Ghalibaf is the new strongman in Iran, by any definition of the word in the Iranian faction in fighting, Ghalibaf is not a hardliner, right? So the idea that Ghalibaf is more hardliner than Khamenei is not true, right? Okay, so that's number one. The number two problem with this thesis is that it has this sort of impoverished spectrum of hardliner versus reformist. I mean, it's like, what hard on what, right? That's why I hate
Right.
the term moderate. Or so moderate what? Like, are you like, you can be like, moderately ugly? I mean, like, what does it mean? You can use moderate on everything. Like, moderate is like, so even though the term moderate, capital M, is used in Iranian parlance, actually, I usually translate it as centrist because like that's what it means. But it's not clear, what, when Westerners say moderate, they mean just not as scary, basically. But okay, so if that's not a good spectrum, what's a good spectrum? There are basically a number of things. The question is, who is ready, who has an ideological commitment to fighting United States and Israel forever, and who doesn't, right? And I believe most of the guys in power now don't, actually. So I believe Ghalibaf doesn't. Ghalibaf does not have an ideological commitment to fight US and Israel forever.
Is that an ideological commitment which might be long-standing, or is that a reflection of Iran's lack of capacity to actually pursue such a policy?
But here's why the ideological commitment part really matters. When I say ideological commitment, look, Khamenei hated Israel and America not because of 1953 coup, not because of, he hated them because he believed they're evil, because they and he's written long about that, because he believed they represented terrible, corrupt, libertine civilization that is bad for humanity, and he hates them for that reason, right? So it's not about how strong Iran is. It's not about what the U.S. injustice to Iran did. His end goal wasn't good relations between Iran and the United States, right? The way Fidel Castro's end goal was, right? Fidel Castro's a communist, but his end goal was always, okay, Cuba should have good relationship with the United States if we can get rid of our problems. But so that's what I mean with the ideological commitment. So for someone like Ghalibaf, he does not have the same ideological commitment of on Khamenei. And let me end by saying this, it's key, this question that you asked about the capabilities and stuff, right? And this is why the hardliner stuff gets complicated. You can be less of an ideological hardliner, but more of a strategically audacious leader who is happy to fight America. After all, Khamenei had this anti-Western, anti-American commitment, but he was basically a coward and very worried about getting into direct confrontation, which is what is almost like poetic. The way Khamenei is killed and Iran for the first time actually starts attacking all these countries and doing all these things.
Right.
You would think it basically could have never happened under Khamenei, because he just was not, he was too risk averse, basically. Which is why after killing off Soleimani, he didn't do shit. And which is why all these years he never, he never took, even when Iran was in a better position militarily in some ways, he never took the fight forward, right? He preferred to fight dirty in this way.
Well, and just I mean, as a bit of a follow-on from that, the use of the Hormuz weapon, I assume within the context of the Iranian establishment, only opened up as a real possibility because of the pain being inflicted on Iran and the risk to the regime that they would then make that move. Was there anyone in the regime who was that talked about at all as a possibility from the more, I know we don't want to say hardline, but perhaps more aggressive elements within the regime?
We can say hardline. It's just like left and right wing. Like we use these terms. If we just have to know their limits, right? I'm not saying don't use the term hardline. I'm just saying we have to know their limits. Just like with left and right, sometimes, right? It's like they don't answer everything, right? It's Tucker Carlson like to the left or right of Trump, right? Like it's it's open to question, I guess. Whatever. Okay. So look, I said about the Hormuz Strait, it was always talked about as something that could happen, right? It was always, and now that it has happened, actually, the Iranian sort of security thinking is evolving into thinking, oh, well, this is great. Like, this is obviously this great tool that we had that we didn't, it was really seen as an empty promise, because they said it, it would be fun to Google it and go and see how many times over the years Iranian commanders said, we're going to close the Hormuz Strait. And to be honest, it wasn't even clear what technically that means. Like, are you going to put all these like ships in between? Like, how are you closing the strait? It's not clear what it means. It's like, they're going to mine the strait, they're going to attack the ships so that, passing through it is not possible. And now they have this idea that crazily enough Trump is open to, is to like have some sort of a toll road there and financially benefit from it, which European Union has also opposed, right? But there are ways to make it happen, I think, actually. Anyways, so the biggest victory of Iran out of this war is the Hormuz Strait. Is that they knew something that was like a fantasy of hardliners, actually. Like, I think I imagine, like, in an average meeting of National Security Council, the more serious diplomatic guys would just sort of sit like this and tell, you're going to close the whole strait, again with that fantasy, who's going to bring the global order down. But now it's possible because they saw every bet was off, right? So they went for it. Yeah.
So obviously the discussion we're having now is different to the one we would have been having 2-3 weeks ago, when the most catastrophic scenarios seemed more plausible. Again, all of this is provisional for the moment, because we don't know what might happen in the future. But so I had some questions about regional and ethnic splintering, the role of the Kurds, who supposedly were being armed, and so on. I don't know if we want to talk about that now, because it might not be the most pressing question, in a way that maybe a month ago it seemed like it was. But I do want to ask about the internal Iranian opposition. Arash, you reported on a meeting in which the non-monarchist, I don't even know, I think you maybe deliberately didn't use the term Republican, but the non-monarchist opposition in Iran came together, and there really are people from very different ideological perspectives, but as a potential opposition to the Islamic Republic, but not one which would be happy to rally behind Pahlavi and the monarchist faction. And you found that potentially promising. What is the state of the Iranian opposition now?
So first of all,
how's it? Yeah.
We usually do use the word Republican. Actually, the reason I didn't use it there is that technically some of the people there are actually monarchists, and this was hard to explain in the piece.
Are they moderate monarchists?
That's a very good one. No, they really are, actually. That's literally what they are. Yeah, but also what they are is, this is a very unique phenomenon that we have, which is that there are monarchists who don't like Pahlavi, which is kind of a little humorous, because then they tell them, well, we're monarchists, but like, I was like, well, what do you think our fucking
if only we could elect our king,
Exactly. That's like, there's an internal joke in there. It's like, Fukuyama has this bad emperor problem. It's like, this is a problem with monarchism. You don't get to pick the guy. And after him is his daughter, who I knew in New York. Like, maybe she's good, maybe she's bad, but that's the whole problem with monarchism. So you don't like your current king, but you believe in a system which has someone there. Anyways, but there are people who are ideologically what they like to call themselves constitutionalists, which means constitutional monarchists, right? So, but 90% of people in the room were what we call Republicans, and that is the term we use. Look, so the state of Iranian opposition is terrible. There is no Iranian opposition in a way. Like, if by opposition we mean a politically coherent enough force that can actually do something as a force, it really basically doesn't exist. The closest things that exist to it are a cult called MEK, which is based in Albania, which is a cult, and most Iranians don't like it. It's a very weird Islamist, Stalinist cult. But it's the only one that actually has some organization, i.e. it has membership organization, it has guns, and it has a base in Albania, as I said. They were kicked out of Iraq. They for many years, they were under Saddam Hussein's protection in Iraq, and then after the invasion, they're in Albania now. Albania accepted them instead of a humanitarian gesture, right? So they will have a place. And then there's Pahlavi. There's a Pahlavi, son of the late Shah, who has many followers inside Iran, has a serious political game in a way, but only so serious because he doesn't also have an organization. Like, he doesn't have a membership organization. Like, I would love to know how many people can he give orders to, right? How many people are in his payroll? And I think the real number is less than 10. Might even be less than 5, right? That tells you everything, right? Like, when we talk about politics, you're not a serious political figure if you don't have a ground game, right?
I mean, this all sounds like, typically, well, very typical of our age, typically populist, to use that term, where you have escalating cycles of street mobilization, right? Increasingly angry, increasingly turbulent, which threaten perhaps at least in the expectations and hopes of those on the ground, of knocking down the regime. No real figure, no real kind of ideological unity organically thrown up by the street protesters, and a cast of potential leaders with no kind of organic connection to the street, or at least
So
no
this is a very
real
good way
kind of
of putting it. Yeah.
organizational web connecting them. So it looks typically populist in that sense of having this political oppositional energy, but no real capacity on the part of any ostensible leader to actually exercise leadership.
So actually, I don't know how controversial these names are on this podcast or not, but this is why when I talk about Iranian opposition, I say the best books you should read are books by people like Vincent Bevins and Anton Jagger, who talk about this, like, similar to what you were talking about. This
Well,
problem.
indeed, we've had conversations with Anton and with Vincent on this podcast, specifically about these matters. We've written about it in our book as well, etc. So I mean, that's why I raise it, because it does seem to be very typical of our times in that regard. The fact that Iran's a dictatorship doesn't mean that it is actually that different from a lot of phenomena we've seen in kind of Western democracies as well.
Yeah, so I think a lot of these phenomenon are similar, and so I was just naming the Iranian opposition for you. Yes, so the Iran Freedom Congress that met in London, I was a part of it. That yes, I am. It was a good first step, but there are tons of steps now. Will we take it or not? What needs to happen is we need to find a membership organization, invite everyone to join, build up a serious sort of program, build up a serious organizational apparatus, and it's very hard to do that. And if we do everything right, it will take probably a couple of years before we can be serious political players. Will they do it or not? We'll see. I was optimistic coming out of London. I still am, but okay, we'll see what happens or not. What happens a lot is that people just don't follow up on these things. And I'll tell you something. Look, I'm 38. I was much more of a political activist at a younger age than I am now. And the reason for that is simple. When you don't have these organizations, it's just much harder to be at the building generation, So when I'm a much easier political activist when I'm living in Canada. I joined the NDP. I'm happy to put 40 hours a week during an electoral campaign or something for the NDP, because the stakes are clear. There's an organization, you help it. The goal is the election. You win. If you win, you can change policies and all that, right? In a situation like Iran, I think we need organization as much as any other case, democratic or non-democratic. But the amount of work you put in, it's a lot. And politics is, in many ways, for me at least, is sort of a unpleasant business compared to all the other things. Jump into reading and writing and going to the opera. So as Oscar Wilde says, the problem in socialism is all the evenings it takes, right? So these are some really interesting problems. Is that I think a lot of people in the Iranian opposition also, like, you haven't had enough people who want to do politics. Which is why actually the only thing I respect Pahlavi for is that he's actually doing politics, but he's not doing it enough and on a serious enough scale. But politics is doing this; it's organizing meetings, is doing, and he has
and his pitch seems to be as much to the American leadership as to the Iranian people. So
this is his other problem. His theory of change is basically America and Israel putting him on the throne, which is just a bad strategy. I don't even care about whether it's unethical or non-national or treasonous. It's just not going to work, because this is not, it's just not. Why would they do that? Even if they were going to do that, you need to have, to be naughty here, Germans would put you on the train to Russia, but only if you already have a organization, right? So, he's no Lenin because he does not have anything, doesn't have an organization, doesn't have capabilities, So he's not going to get the help that he thinks.
So maybe this is the moment to kind of broaden out then and look at what we've learned, because players have had to show their hands, obviously, in this war. And I think we've learned some big things over the past couple of months. The world has learned some things, and that isn't just a sort of intellectual exercise of going, oh, okay, that's interesting, but will have real serious political consequences. So I think the first one regards asymmetric warfare and what Iran has been able to achieve, the vulnerabilities it's exposed in the US's global dominance, particularly with regard to the Gulf Arabs, and the US's seeming inability to protect them. How do you read that, Arash? And indeed, and Lee, also please do jump in here, because that seems to have correct me if I'm wrong, but my read on that is that we are in a radically different world to the one we were in February in that regard.
So I'll let Lee go first. This time Lee should go first, maybe, and then I can react and I can tell you what I think.
There's a lot to say in response to that, and I would distinguish between lessons that this episode reminds us of, lessons that we should have already internalized from the past, and then some newish developments. So the old lessons are, firstly, the limits of military power in securing political goals. Right, we should have learned this from Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Vietnam. Secondly, the remarkable resilience of large nation states when faced with external military aggression. Right, this was a 19th century gunboat diplomacy type operation waged against a 21st century nation state and in a 21st century globalized economy. Right, the basic idea was sail the gunboat up to the coast, lob some shells at the Sultan's palace, and they'll quickly capitulate and you'll get what you want. It's just utterly deluded. Thirdly, I think attacks against deeply entrenched regimes with dispersed command structures that have already been preparing for exactly this kind of war are quite unlikely to succeed. And the fourth thing it reminds us of is that populations suffering intense aerial bombardment rarely rise up against their rulers. Right? These are established lessons of history. The fact that these lessons have still not been learned exposes how limited is the paleoconservative critique of neoconservatism. All it seems to do is rule out boots on the ground, possibly, maybe not even that, and liberal regime change operations, but it does not rule out deluded militarism and interventionism per se. So that's one set of lessons that I think we can learn from it. What are the kind of newish implications that point to this brave new world that we seem to have entered into? Firstly, I think the war has exposed the fragility of American military power, particularly the rapid depletion of America's military arsenal when confronted with an inferior enemy, particularly when it comes to long-range missiles and missile defense. Secondly, the vulnerability of American bases to military and drone attack. Now, this is kind of an open secret in strategic circles since around 2017, but it is now very clearly exposed. That has significant implications in Asia, where you would have to look at American bases in the Indo-Pacific and say these are now very vulnerable to Chinese hypersonic missile attack. If bases in the Gulf are vulnerable to attack by far inferior Iranian weapons. Thirdly, I think the United States is now widely understood as a rogue state. Remarkably, there is considerable sympathy for Iran. Of all the regimes on the planet, for people to feel sympathy for, I think they've played the game quite well, particularly for a regime that was massacring its own people in the streets a few weeks ago. I was speaking to one very senior diplomat from the Global South, whose view was that Iran had been relatively restrained in its retaliation and had played a tit-for-tat game, and the United States was the one that was principally at fault. The fourth implication, I think, is that Western elites now have to confront with sober senses the reality of what the United States has become, the degraded nature of the American Republic, launching a demented war, lashing out at its allies. And I really think there's no way back from this. This is why it's not like Iraq in 2003. So people were horrified some people at least were horrified at the US-UK invasion of Iraq. But it was all blamed on Bush as individual idiot. And then when Obama came back in, everybody was happy that normal service has been resumed. I think nobody in Europe now believes that normal service is going to be resumed. This is going to trigger a worldwide effort to de-risk and to rearrange energy supplies and so on. and to really guard against the erratic behavior of the United States. And then for analysts, I think the conclusion we have to draw is that this is not five-dimensional chess, although there are still people arguing that it is, right? It's some grand strategy aimed at throttling China. It's not even checkers or noughts and crosses, right? This has disastrous implications for the United States in terms of the midterms at home, inflation, global supply chains, semiconductors, fertilizers. This is, I say, like it's a 19th century style mentality deployed for problems of the 21st century. And I could go on, but I think I better stop and allow Arash to give his view.
No, thank you. Very well put and many thought-provoking points. The way they were all coming in on this question of, it's Trump an anomaly, or like, is there a return to normal? I mean, I think Trump is an anomaly in some ways. That the U.S. will actually very likely go back to some other thing after 2028. But even if that happens, you're right that a lot of other countries, will de-risk, and it's not just a degradation of American Republic. I think it's a recognition that, okay, you have a superpower with this much interest and the voting population of 300 something million, and a boisterous democracy of sorts. It's actually the opposite of the problem. Is not that there's these entrenched elites. It doesn't matter what people vote for. The problem is that it does matter what people vote for, and you can have different sorts of electoral appeals to them. What would stop a candidate that runs for Democrats or Republicans who actually runs on getting the green land and some other thing, right? So I think that problem is always there, and you don't have a ruling class, which perhaps was best demonstrated by someone like George Bush, the father, who is very patrician and who knows its limits and wants to work within a system. So I think, the rest of the world will have to deal with that. Although I'll tell you, there's no easy answer to it. The United States is massively powerful. So all this question of American decline, I have sort of questions about them. The United States controls 25% of the world economy. It obviously has this massive military. So yes, there's this imperial decline and all that, latest stage. We all know, I love the latest stage always, because latest stage capitalism has also been going on for a while. But in
late Soviet America, as we've called it before.
Exactly, yeah. Brezhnev, Biden was Brezhnev, and also we can have all this like analogies, but the reality is the United States, it's a powerful force there. Okay, so one question perhaps to ask is this the Suez moment? That I've been thinking about that. So a lot of analysts and stuff, they're talking about Suez moment. This is in 1956, of course, when Britain, France, and Israel conspired together to attack Egypt, and United States pulled them back effectively, and Britain was confirmed as a waning power. United States was confirmed as a rising power. I don't think it's a very good analogy on the first. I'm just writing about Suez right now, so I'm very deep in the actual Suez, 1956. But I don't think it's a very good analogy because, first of all, by 1956, it was clear that Britain is a waning power with so many real indicators. Already, Harold Macmillan, would come to say around the same time, maybe a little after, because I think Eden was prime minister then. But Harold Macmillan would say to America, we will be Greece, you be Rome. Right. So the idea was that we're this waning power. And of course, there was the United States to replace. Whereas what is the idea? The idea is not that China would replace the United States. But I think in a more limited way of that is that it's clear that the age of preponderant unilateral American power is over. And Trump learns that he can't, in fact, just dictate everything he wants. And Iran will be his, a reminder of that. Now, so in a way, what it is for me is a reconfirmation of the multipolar world order, that we've been talking about for a while, and it's clear that it's here. And yes, if you're a Mearsheimerist or whatever, you would see that the chaotic nature of the world order is indeed demonstrated. But it's gonna be interesting. For example, Lee, you said, some global South diplomats have sympathy for Iran. They think it's been restrained. Who does not have sympathy for Iran is pretty much all the other countries in the Middle East. Because even if you look at the perspective of someone like Turkey, they're not happy with U.S. attacking Iran. But at the same time, they see this revolutionary, revanchist Iran that is, attacked Kuwait, attacked UAE, attacked Saudis, attacked everybody, and they're sort of thinking, okay, what's the future of Iran as a neighbor?
But I mean, if we think about the Arab Gulf states, right, are they not in a situation in which they might feel that if they can't be protected anymore by the United States, that they're vulnerable, that they might need to
I'm very glad
rearrange
you
their
brought this
alliances
up.
in such a way?
I'm very glad you brought this up. This is a very good topic to tackle. First of all, the short answer is like, oh, does this show that the United States protection doesn't mean anything to them? No, it doesn't show it, because first of all, well, would it be better if they were not protected by the US to begin with in any form, right? If the idea is that US is not enough and they also need, and they call it a lot, they call it diversification. Diversification is like almost like a threat that they use in meetings at the US, by which they mean we'll also get help from Russia, also get help from China. They're not as stupid. They've been wanting something like that for a long time, and they have gotten it to a degree. UAE is today a member of BRICS, right? It's one of my fun facts. I was at recently a meeting in Colombia, and someone was going on and on about the anti-imperialist BRICS, as opposed to lackeys in
Right.
the region. I said, the UAE is a member of the BRICS. Of course, he didn't even know. So UAE is a member of BRICS. All these others, on the Russia-Ukraine issue, I think you saw something very interesting, right? Everybody whose theory is that these countries are just lackeys of the US have to answer the fact that, why didn't, on the very key issue of US-Ukraine, they basically said no to the West. They're like, we're not going to do that. We don't care. It's not our issue. You care about US invasion of Ukraine, democracy, whatever, not our rodeo. We're not going to be a part of this. So, look, no, I don't think it shows that US can't protect them. It shows that US protection has limits. And that the fact that US didn't sort of inform them or consult them before launching the attack, they will complain about that. But look, these countries, if you're Kuwait, you're one family controlling this very lucrative little corner for a couple of centuries, basically. And for the last, more than a century, you've done it with the help of UK and then US and then the international system that actually accepts your sovereignty, right? So when Iraq just walks in and takes you over, the world will come to your help and drive them out. So I never understand what's the argument here. Like, why would Kuwait after this be like, we really don't need the US? The reason Kuwait exists is the international system of sovereignty and the US, right? So because it was disrupted for a few weeks, it doesn't mean that it was just useless to begin with. It shows that it has limits, like everything else in the world has limits. But would they want to live in the, would they want to live with Iran as a neighbor without the protection of the US or other powers? I mean, that surely would be much worse than living it with this protection. And remarkable, we have to just remember also the remarkable standards of living that these countries have had. We could have just an episode just about GCC, right? But these are countries in which people have GDP per capita of tens of thousands of dollars. The average Kuwaiti citizen, like average Kuwaiti public sector worker, makes $80,000, $90,000, if not more, and they've worked like 3 hours a day. This is a very nice. This is a very nice sort of mode of life to have. Okay, so and they're gonna protect that basically. And they're going to protect that. They're not going to give in easily to Iran. And UAE, its advanced economy, Saudi Arabia, with all its regional power pretensions. Yeah. So, and they're going to protect that, and they're going to use American. That's why the fantasy of Iran that it's going to get US bases out of this region, founders here, because the US is there because this not because it's just an imperial overlord and it's forcing itself in this region, but it's because it's very useful to these countries. It's the other way around, frankly. The real scary prospect for them is if US says at some point that we don't care about this region at all, we're just going to leave, right? Which many have in the American right have also said it should. And the reason the US is not going to do that, of course, is that because the Hormuz Strait matters, and because the energy supplies still matter, and because Israel matters. I mean, so because of these reasons, US is not going to abandon the Middle East. Yeah, I hope that answers that.
I agree with some of that, but I think it's important to return to the bigger picture. So it's important to acknowledge, as you did at the start, Alex, that The peace talks are still ongoing. If they've even started, you can't rule out a return to conflict or renewed escalation. But I think if you look at what has happened so far, it's difficult to conclude that this is anything but a comprehensive strategic defeat for the United States, which is probably the worst it has endured since Vietnam. Because I think it's worse than what happened in Iraq because of the truly global implications of what we've seen over the past few weeks. So let's have a think about the war aims. They set out to kill the Ayatollah. Yep, they did that, but the regime is still in place. And the best off-ramp is a deal that leaves the regime in place. Secondly, they set out to destroy Iran's capacity to threaten the region. They haven't done that.
They've demonstrated the opposite.
Well, they have destroyed a lot of military materiel, the weak navy, the weak air force, and they've inflicted immense damage and suffering on the Iranian people. But Iran is still capable of striking regional targets. Its proxies are still active. It's insisting it won't relinquish its right to enrich uranium. Did it get a popular uprising or regime change? No. The regime apparently feels secure enough at home to continue the war by insisting that Israel must adhere to a ceasefire in Lebanon before opening the strait. The Hormuz weapon, which was only primarily theoretical in the past, has now been activated, and they might get a permanent toll paid in yuan or cryptocurrency. I think I take Arash's point about the interests of the ruling establishments in the Middle East, but even if outside options to US protection are limited, which clearly they are, and that's a problem for a lot of states around the world, as we've discussed on the podcast before, it must be the case that there is serious damage done to the Gulf allies' confidence in the United States. They were apparently not consulted about the war. Their missile defenses were drained. Very significant damage has been done to their infrastructure and their economies. They had to turn to Ukraine for help with missile defense. And by the way, anybody that once thought that the cause of Ukraine was linked to the cause of Palestinian liberation clearly needs their heads examining. NATO has been split over the question of US basing access, and the case for European strategic autonomy has been strengthened immeasurably. Oil sanctions on Iran, which were in place since 1996, have been lifted temporarily, and Trump is actively mooting sanctions and tariff relief as part of any settlement. Oil sanctions on Russia were lifted. Several nations have resumed trading in Russian oil, including US treaty allies. The United States asked China for help to defeat Iran. And of course, the Chinese look good by comparison, merely by doing nothing. And Chinese green tech exports will likely benefit from accelerated de-risking and decarbonization efforts to reduce dependence on the Middle East and American energy exports. And more broadly, I think American prestige has been shattered. Weaknesses have been badly exposed, as I say, with significant holes in its defense systems in the Indo-Pacific. I think there's no positive spin we can put on this conflict for the United States. So I agree with what you say about Suez. It's not a Suez moment because, unlike with Britain and France in 1956, there is no higher power to rein in the United States, right? There were adults in the room. The Soviets and the Americans were saying, no, we can't really allow this to happen. Now there is no adult in the room, right? The so-called adult has gone rogue. But I don't think it's
They're
a
adults, they don't have the power.
either.
I mean, you could say China is like more of an adult, but they don't have the same power.
Yeah, perhaps so. But it's still not multipolar in the sense that, as you say, the preponderance of American military and economic power is such that no other power can balance or deter it. There is just great disorder, right? They're kind of a dying empire lashing out as it dies, and the rest of us have to suffer the consequences.
I don't know about the dying part, but
difficult to see how this is not a very significant blow, it seems to me, to
the
American
empire
power
part
worldwide.
The dying empire, I'm not sure about the dying or the empire part. I think, and there's also a global system post 1945 that the US had an important role in propping up, and it very benefited the US, but it also wasn't just an American empire.
Indeed, and it's played a big role in tearing it down as well. This is part of that whole process unfurling. But maybe we should leave that here. There's so many other things that I wanted to get on, but we'll have to do separate episodes on that. Arash, obviously, you're always welcome back to do that, if as regards to Iran. But there are important consequences which we at most touched on with regard to China, with regard to Europe, with regard to Trump and MAGA as well, and where that will lead internally in the US. Is there a MAGA without Trump that emerges from this? Lots of big questions to be asked, and we'll continue to them on this podcast. For now, thank you very much, Arash, as always, for joining us. It's been very enlightening.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys for having me.